Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from a familiar voice, Professor Ebrahim Bagheri, who you are likely all familiar with due to his involvement with our RAI group. Professor Bagheri is an interdisciplinary researcher who focuses on efficient and responsible information retrieval methods and who has impacted industry, government, and civil society through community engagement and knowledge translation. Before joining the Faculty of Information at U of T, Ebrahim held a Canada Research Chair in Social Information Retrieval and an NSERC Industrial Research Chair in Social Media Analytics at TMU. He also founded and directed the NSERC Create Initiative on Responsible AI, the group that we are all here from today, and is the associate editor at IEEE Transactions on Network Science and Engineering, as well as ACM Transactions on Intelligent Systems and Technology. In 2019, Ebrahim received the Government of Canada NSERC Synergy Award for innovation for his outstanding industry academia collaborations. Ebrahim, you have said that this might be a polarizing talk, but I'm sure we will all enjoy it. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Calvin. Some of you may have heard this talk before. I gave this talk at KDD in the PhD symposium, and also gave this talk at my course 2210, the last lecture. So if this is a repeat for you, I do apologize, and feel free to drop off now. But I don't think it's going to be a polarizing talk. I think it's going to be a different talk, and we'll see how it goes. Let's see if I can somehow see my own screen and also see your faces. How do I do that? Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Maybe I'll do it this. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about is knowing, deciding, being with and despite AI. So the first question you will ask me is, with this title for a talk, what are you even going to be talking about? And the very short summary of my talk is, there's all this technology in the world, AI, crypto, whatever you think about, and we are a bunch of confused people. Can we even be happy and live a happy life despite all of the technology that we're dealing with? I realize that this is a very, very generic and broad description of what I'm going to be talking about, and so you might ask me, can you be a little bit more specific on what you're going to be talking about? And I would say my talk has these four pillars. And when I start going through this content, you might actually become more confused as I go along, and that is by design. If you're confused at different parts of this talk, please know that I've achieved my objective. The talk will have four different aspects. I will talk a little bit about epistemology as it relates to data and knowledge. I will talk a little bit about ethics, what is right and what is wrong, and what does that even mean in the context of AI and data science. I will talk a little bit about existentialism and what is the definition of self, and how the definition of self might change given the developments in AI. And then I will talk a little bit about political philosophy, power, justice, how the dynamics impacts humans, and then maybe I will try to put all of these things together towards the end of the talk to see whether we can even be happy despite or with AI technology. So I will start with this concept of epistemology, and what does data mean? What does data mean as knowledge? So the first question I will put to you is data ever raw? As data scientists, we typically think that there's some data in the real world, We just have to collect that data, sufficient amount of data, clean that data, and train an AI model so that it reflects the data that we collected and allows us to make predictions. This is a typical mindset of an AI person who looks to build a new model. So the question is the data that's out there in the world, is this raw data, or the data that we collect is already shaped by some interpretation that we are not aware of? So what do I mean by this question? There's a study that I really like by Bartlett in 1932. It's called The War of Ghosts. What Bartlett did was took a story, a folk tale, a Native American folk tale. The folk tale was called The War of the Ghosts, and uh, told this story to a group of people. And after he told this story to these people, at different time intervals, he asked these people to recollect the story, to retell the story, to tell him again what they remember about the story. What happened was, when people started retelling the story, they recollected different parts of the story in different ways. They didn't remember the story exactly the way they were told the story. They started reconstructing the story in a way that the story actually aligned with their own cultural norms and expectations. So, if this was a person who came from a white, privileged background, they changed that Native American story to kind of align with their own expectations. And Bartlett asked these people to retell the story at different points in time. The more time went on, the details of the story became more distorted by people, and the story was told in different ways by the same person, but at different time intervals. So basically, why this happens is because our memory as humans is not actually taking screenshots of events and then retrieving them in the future, but rather our memory is a reconstruction of what we think happened. So if you think about a childhood memory, you actually don't have a screenshot of your childhood where you retrieve it and then you retell that memory, but rather you have ideas of what happened in your childhood. And when you retell the story of your childhood, you're actually reconstructing a memory of those concepts that you have. So if you tell me about a memory you had your childhood today, and then you retell me that childhood memory in 5 years, it might be different things because you have concepts in your head and then you reconstruct those concepts. So why is this important? The same concept of memory in humans is applicable to how we deal with data in AI systems. We collect a bunch of data, but then the story we put, the narrative we put on the data that we have collected is shaped by our own expectations of the story that this data should tell. So how we collect data, what type of data points we collect, what type of questions we ask of the data, which instruments we use to clean the data, and things of this nature actually shape how we collect the data and how we analyze it, and essentially shapes the AI models that we train at the end. So it doesn't seem to be, while the data seems to be sitting there out in the world and they seem to be raw, the data that we collect and the models we build are a reconstruction of our own thoughts as people who build systems. The data practitioner, us as data practitioners, people engaged with AI, we are actually kind of layering on our own expectations and our own thoughts onto the systems that we build. So now the question is, if there is a role that the AI scientists or the AI people are actually playing in shaping the narrative on the data, whose knowledge actually counts, who's playing a role in building these systems. So there's this concept of epistemic injustice, and we are kind of, I think, all of us very familiar with this type of injustice, where there's some form of prejudice and there's some bias against certain groups of people, and these people are not believed, for instance, because they lack credibility, or there's some bias against certain subpopulations. So you could say, um, if you think about certain biases against females, there is not sufficient amount of representations of, let's say, females in AI, broadly speaking. So if a female goes to an interview at a high-tech company, maybe the interviewers will look at them in an inferior way. The likelihood of them being hired is lower, etc. We call this a kind of a testimonial injustice, where the person is not believed because there's some form of prejudice. And we are all aware of this type of bias. We've been talking about it for a long time. But there's this other type of injustice, which we call hermeneutical injustice, which is, it's not because we don't believe or trust the person that there's some form of injustice, but rather we can't even begin to understand the perspective of that person when they tell us something. And therefore, there's some form of injustice happening. So the very famous example of this is that many years ago, where ADHD was not recognized as an issue, people who lacked focus, people who couldn't manage their time, were overwhelmed with content, they were labeled as being disorganized, right? Because other people couldn't even recognize the condition that people suffering from ADHD were going through. And so there was an injustice because others couldn't even begin to understand. So there's this really interesting study that I really like. It's by Cole and colleagues from 1971. It's a cultural context of, it's called the cultural context of thinking. What they did was they took some memory testing tasks to Liberian kids. And what they did was they showed them these North American questionnaires that tested how well Liberian kids perform on memory tasks, memorization tasks. The more items, for instance, they showed them a bunch of items and they said, how many of these items do you remember? The more items they remembered, of course, they had better memory. The finding was that these Liberian kids had really poor scores on memorization tasks. And now the question is, are these kids from Liberia really bad? They have bad memories? What is it? What they found was that if they changed the questionnaire to use now, instead of North American global North objects in the questionnaire, to objects that are familiar to Liberian kids, they have the same memory capacity. The problem was that they were using objects in their questionnaire that was not familiar to Liberian kids. As an outcome, because these kids had not seen these objects in their life, they had a hard time recollecting what those objects were. When they changed the objects to things that they had interacted with and knew, their level of memory was on par to kids in the global north. So, they actually, people will excel on tasks related to memory if they are dealing with culturally embedded objects that they're familiar with. Otherwise, they will fail. So what does this mean? This means that if you are putting AI systems at scale across the world with impacting people from different backgrounds, people who are familiar with your conceptualization of a cultural norm will benefit from that AI system. But anyone else from other parts of the world who's not familiar with your conceptualization of the world will struggle. to work with those systems, and therefore they will systematically be put at a disadvantage. And this type of hermeneutical injustice, where in AI systems, where we who build the AI systems have our own conceptualization of reality, and we impose our conception of reality on the AI systems, we can't even begin to think how people from other parts of the world or different cultures struggle to work with these AI systems, and we assume that there's some inferiority there, that these type of people can't work with AI systems, or they're just so behind with technology that they can't interact. But whereas we are building AI systems at scale, putting on them our own conceptualizations of what the system should look like, and therefore kind of creating this what I would call hermeneutical injustice. Now, when there is some form of now injustice, we have collected the data in our own way, in the way that we think is right, and then the system kind of creates this injustice. Now, what is the big question is, ethically speaking, what is right, what is wrong, and who is responsible? I'm going to try to turn off this hand gesture. I have no idea how to do it. But you will see these fancy things going on behind me. Zoom is picking up on the hand gestures. I don't know why. So who is responsible? And in terms of responsibility, what is right and what is wrong? So let's look at a study. Bardarli and Latanier, they have this very famous, and you may have heard of this, bystander effect or bystander apathy. And what they did was they put a bunch of participants in situation where they witnessed an emergency happening to someone. So let's say they put someone on a street, and then they had an actor play a role of someone who had a seizure, and they looked at how these subjects reacted to the situation, right? And so what they found was that their subjects in the study were less likely to intervene, or took longer time to intervene, if there were people present on the scene. So let's say if the participants were on the scene and they were alone and there was a person who had seizure, that person was very quick to react and try to help the person who had seizure. But if there was more people, like there was 5 or 6 people around, the subject either did not intervene or took longer to decide to intervene and help. So the more people around, the less likely people will take action and in serious conditions. And this is what we call the bystander effect. And so think about large tech projects. You're working at Facebook, Meta, you're working at Google, etc. And you find that you kind of encounter a situation that you're not comfortable with. You're building a system that you don't think is ethical, or you're collecting data that you shouldn't be collecting. The bystander effect says, if you're working in large teams, the likelihood of you taking action decreases, because you think there's so many other people around, maybe they will take action, maybe they will do something. And so the likelihood of you doing something decreases, and therefore what we call the ethical weight is distributed across so many different people, that people within the team do not actually feel too much ethical weight on their own shoulders to take action. Now, if that is the case, then who takes ownership of the harm? Who will take action, and who will do something? And this is, the response to this question is another study, which is called the cognitive dissonance topic. Festinger and Carl Smith looked at this in the 50s, and what they found was, they did a very interesting study. they took a group of people, divided them into two groups. They gave both groups of these people a very, very, very boring task to do. And they said, once they finished, they gave the first group $1, and they asked them to go and tell their friends that this task was not boring, that it was a very enjoyable task, a lot of fun, and that they should do it. They gave the second group $20, and they said, go tell your friends that this was enjoyable and fun. And both groups did this. They took the dollar, or they got the $20, and they told their friends this was enjoyable. And then once they told their friends, they did a questionnaire. And they asked the people to actually report their level of enjoyment of doing this boring task. And what they found was that the people who were paid $1 reported higher levels of enjoyment compared to the people who received $20. Both groups of people were the same sets of comparable people. They did the same task. All of them told their friends this was enjoyable. The only difference was one group had received $1, one group had received $20. The people who had received $1 reported higher enjoyment. The people who were paid $20, they reported lower enjoyment. And the explanation for this is that the people who had received $1, they didn't have sufficient justification for lying. The people who had received $20, they told themselves, well, I lied because they gave me $20, and $20 was worth, lying. Okay, I just did a harmless lie and I got $20. I know I lied. But the person who received $1 couldn't convince themselves that they just went out and lied for just $1. So they internally revised their own belief to say, it was actually enjoyable. I didn't lie. I just told the truth. So of course, they just give me $1, so I'm not lying. I enjoyed it. So they actually convinced themselves that they're not lying. They enjoyed the task. So this is cognitive dissonance. And what happens? So now I ask you, and maybe you can raise your hand if you agree with one of these two statements. If you are one of these high-tech companies and you have a project that's borderline ethical, borderline unethical, and you're hiring a team to do this task, would you need to pay the people on this team each $1 million to convince them to do this? Or you just pay them bare minimum wage and get them to do this project? Those of you who think you should pay them a lot of money, just either raise your virtual or physical hand. Borderline ethical, unethical, you pay $1 million. How many of you pay $1 million to your team? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. How many of you? 6. How many of you would pay bare minimum? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so those of you 9, those of you, a lot of you are paying bare minimum. Those of you who will pay bare minimum, you will succeed. Because according to cognitive dissonance, the people on your team do not have sufficient justification to engage in unethical behavior. Therefore, they will internalize that they are nerds and they enjoy doing data science projects and they're having fun and they're doing it out of their will and it's not unethical. The people who get $1 million will say, sure, we're doing something unethical, but we're paid for it. So we know it's unethical, but we're just doing it because they're giving us a lot of money, right? So if you go to these high-tech companies and you see like they're big teams and they're doing questionable stuff, and you ask yourself, how is it that these people are doing unethical stuff, but when you talk to them, they don't think it's too bad. It's because they're internalizing cognitive dissonance and kind of thinking internally to themselves, it's not so bad. So, based on cognitive dissonance, people who are getting less money, who are these like low salary AI developers, are people who are internalizing that the stuff that they're doing is not so bad after all. But people who are getting a lot of money, if you talk to them, they may even confess to you that the things they're doing is maybe borderline unethical. So now we know how the system works. The system kind of gets you to justify for yourself that what you're doing is maybe not so bad. But from a power a justice dynamics, what does that mean? So what does that mean to me as an individual person? So let's see how these, as users, how are we impacted by these algorithmic systems? Now, you may have heard of this paradox of choice, which is a very well-known study. People were offered, two options of jams. The first group were given 6 jam flavors. The second group were given 24 flavors of jam. And what they were saying, they said, now make a choice of jams and then tell us whether you're satisfied with your choice or not satisfied. People who were given more choices of jams, that is 24 jams, and they could select a jam from those 24 flavors, ended up being less satisfied with their choice compared to people who were only given 6 choices of jams. People who had limited choices, they were happier with the jam they had chosen. And this study has been, replicated on other things like genes and so on, and it's the same. And this study and similar ones is one of the motivations for Google actually having a white page with one text box. Google is not actually giving you any options. You just go in, you have one option to type in the text and do a search. There's nothing else. And therefore minimizes your options. By minimizing your options, it actually makes you feel more satisfied. Now, too much choice will lead to choice paralysis, or as Jeff is saying, choice overload. The more choices you have, the more paralyzed you are to make choices. Now, so keep that in one side of your brain, and I want to talk about another study, and then we'll put those two together. There's another study by Ash in 1951. It's called the conformity study. This is unbelievable. Like when I read this study, I couldn't believe this is unbelievable. People were there were groups of people. These subjects were put into groups. In each group, there was about 6 to 8 participants. One of these participants was a subject of the study. The other people were playing roles. And in each of these groups were shown one of these, a target line, and 3 options. And the people in that group were asked to say which one of these lines is the same length as the size in the target line. It's very clear. You can just basically take that line, put it on the other ones, and see which one has the same size, has the same length. It's not rocket science. You can do it very easily. But what happened was that the 6 or 7 people who were playing roles in that group mentioned the incorrect line as the line that matches. And the subject who was in that group became confused and said, how is this even possible? Like, why are people saying a line that doesn't match the length? And what happened, and this is the surprising part, 75% of the participants conformed at least once with the general consensus on the group as to which line is the correct line, and they chose against their own belief the incorrect line. So they actually knew which line was correct, but because the other people in the group said the wrong line, they basically said maybe the group is right. So they conformed to the group where in fact they were 100% sure that the line was the incorrect line, but they just basically conformed. So now put together conformity with paradox of choice. Algorithms will limit your options to make you happier, because the more they limit your options, the happier you become because of the paradox of choice. And then what they will do is they will make recommendations to you in a way that you feel that you have to conform to the general consensus of what is good, because that's how people operate in social contexts. So if you think about how collaborative filtering works, Amazon says there were like, in the past hour, 100 people bought this t-shirt. And you say, okay, maybe if 100 people bought that t-shirt, maybe I should buy that t-shirt as well. So they limit your option, they make you happier because of the paradox of choice, and then they force you into a social conformity setting where they tell you, hey, look, 1,000 people are looking at this flight right now. Maybe you should be buying that flight. So it seems that algorithmically speaking, higher user satisfaction will actually lead to erosion of your autonomy. But as users, we are happy to give up our autonomy for some degree of feeling satisfaction. So that's how the algorithms are working. But now, from a governance perspective, what does all of this mean? So if the algorithm is taking away my autonomy, and sure, maybe you say I don't care about my autonomy, and that's fine, and it's totally up to you. I just want to be happy all the time. And if that means I give away my autonomy, but in return I receive happiness, is that what you want? Now, let's see what that means for the user in practical terms. To tell you what this means, we'll have to look at another study from 1995, which is called the Self-Fulfilling Prophecies, a very interesting study. It's at the start of a school year, teachers were asked to look at students in their class and predict the academic potential, motivation, and expected performance of the student in their class, right? So let's say, I'm in a certain class and I have 15 students. Without actually engaging with my students, I'm asked to write down what I think about Omid, Jeff, Kelly, Mohammed, Chantal. Just do a prediction of how they will do at the end of the year, right? So teachers were asked to do this. The interesting finding was that teachers' expectations at the beginning of the year was highly correlated with the end of the year student performance. So whatever I thought about Omid turned out to be what he performed at the end of the year, which you might say teachers are really good at knowing what their students are capable of, right? I look at Riley and I say, Riley's going to get an A at the end of the year, and he gets an A. So that's like, this teacher is really good at predicting students' performance. This prediction, the expectation of the teacher was even more highly correlated with the students' previous standardized tests, their socioeconomic background, their academic achievements, their IQ test. It was way more correlated. So the teacher's expectation. Now, the surprising part about this is, how does this even happen? The reason is the teacher's prediction does not remain the teacher's prediction. It becomes what the student tends to become. So if I think that Vidya is a very good student, I will start to spend more time with Vidya during the class. I will pay more attention to Vidya, and therefore Vidya will become, during the term or during the year, the good student. If I think Javad is a poor student, I will give up hope on Javad during the term. I will not spend time with Javad. I will probably mark his assignments with more rigor. I will give him lower marks. During the term, he will start to see that I am disappointed in his performance. He will become disappointed in his own performance, and he will become the poor student that I predicted he will be. So the teacher's expectations are not correlated with the student's performance. They are what the student will become in effect, right? So what does that mean for AI? For AI, what we want and the algorithms predict is actually not what we want and what we want to become or what we want to receive. We will become what the algorithm actually predicts what we want. So if Amazon actually predicts that I want item A, B, and C, and I end up buying item A and B and C, that doesn't mean that I actually wanted item A and B and C. It means that I became a subject that conformed to the algorithm's expectation of my behavior, which is very different from what I actually wanted. And now, if you think about the algorithms being trained on historical data and then tested on a held out set, that doesn't mean that the algorithm actually predicted accurately what I wanted. It actually means the algorithm predicted accurately what the algorithm could put on me so that I would conform to the algorithm's expectations, which is very different from what I actually wanted. So algorithms will predict how they can materialize their own expectations on the users, which is very different from what the actual users want. So what does that mean to the definition of the self, to the human? So let's look at how algorithms will actually change who we are. Some of you may have heard of the Bateson study, which is called the EYES study. And this is a very interesting study, again, in my opinion. A group of people so some people worked in an office. And so these experimenters put a coffee machine, a coffee station, a tea station on the side of the office space. And people were told that this coffee and tea is free. They don't have to pay for it. But they put a volunteer box right beside the tea machine, the coffee machine. And they were told, if you feel like it and if you like, you can donate a little bit of money and put it in this coffee machine. And they called it an honesty box. They looked at this for 10 weeks, how much money they collected. In 5 of these 10 weeks, they put a photo of a very nice flower at the top of the coffee machine. In 5 of those other weeks, they put an eye, a person's eye, at the top of the coffee machine. That was the only difference. 5 weeks the flower, 5 weeks an eye. Guess what happened? They counted how much money was collected in the first 5 weeks compared to the money collected in the second 5 weeks. The weeks that had the eye on top of the coffee machine had collected 3 times more money compared to the flower, right? So when people thought they were being watched, they actually put in more money into the money box. And this concept of being watched doesn't actually have to be actual surveillance. It's the idea that I may be watched. So the eye image kind of gave people this idea that as soon as they saw an eye, they thought, oh, maybe someone's looking at us. Maybe someone's monitoring us. And they actually put in more money into the machine, into the money box. So the idea of being observed actually leads to a change in behavior. The fact that you don't have to be observed, you don't have to be monitored or surveilled, just the idea of being surveyed. So what does that mean? If you think you are being watched, your conforming behavior will increase, right? So you conform. Now think about us and AI systems. Pretty much everyone knows now that for AI systems to operate, they need to collect data from you. So everyone now knows that their data is being collected. Or even in scenarios where the data is not collected, people have this perception that there is some form of surveillance that collects their data. So self-representation, the idea of who I am during interaction with AI systems becomes performative. And that performance is what I think the AI system believes I should be performing. Now, if I'm interacting with Google, I would put in stuff that I think are appropriate stuff. If I'm interacting with ChatGPT, if I'm interacting with some AI system, it's not who I am, it's a representation of what I think is acceptable by the AI system. And therefore, the definition of self becomes very blurry now, because is it what you want to be as yourself, or are you always acting in this performative way for the AI systems who are monitoring you, and you don't want them to think of you of something else? So if you're on your Instagram feed, and this might have happened to you, would you watch a certain video on Instagram because you liked it, or you don't watch a certain video on Instagram because you don't want Instagram to think of you in a different way? You want the Instagram representation of you to be a certain representation. You don't want Instagram to think of you badly or in a different way. So you actually change who you are in an interaction with an algorithm. So with all of this said, can we actually live a meaningful life despite or while AI exists? So to answer that question, there's a study that I would encourage all of you to read. It's by King and Napa. They ask this question, what makes a life good? And so they had written these life vignettes of different types of lived lives, experiences. These lives the descriptions had a little bit of happiness in them. Some of them had varying degrees of meaning, sense of purpose, engagement in moral, valuable goals. They had some degrees of success and achievement, like wealth and social status and accomplishments and so on. And what they did was they asked participants to read these vignettes and rate them in 3 different categories. Desirability, is this a good life to live? Moral worth, is this life morally admirable? And personal preference, would you live this life if you had the option? They asked people these three questions. So just read this vignette and then answer these three questions. And what they found was that the lives that were described as high in meaning and moral purpose were the ones that were rated the highest in terms of admirability. People admired lives or those life vignettes that were high in meaning and moral purpose. That meant even if those lives were described as lower in material success. So say you have very modest income, but that life has a lot of moral purpose or meaningful, people admire that life more, right? They even admired it in scenarios where the moral meaning or the purpose meant that you had to suffer. Not only you were lower in material success, but you also had to suffer. You had to endure pain. People even admired those lives more in the face of suffering. What they found was for majority of people, achievement and wealth was not the primary motivation for admiring a certain life. So if I tell you, this here's a life, you make $5 million a year, but your life doesn't have much moral value, or it's not, it doesn't have much meaning. People didn't think that wealth and achievement was correlated with what they would admire. All of those vignettes that included material success but lacked meaning were rated the lowest in terms of admirability and desirability. Now, so what you might ask, what are you trying to say, right? So let me try to tell you what I mean. So if you look at users of AI systems, we want to be happy. We want to live meaningful lives. We want a desirable ethical life. But what makes us happy is very different from what the life that we admire. Admiring something is very different from what gives you immediate satisfaction and happiness. What gives a human an immediate satisfaction and happiness is lesser decisions, lesser tough decisions. So paradox of choice. If I have fewer choices to make on a daily basis, I'm happier. If I think I'm conforming to what everyone else is doing, there's less burden of choice and therefore higher satisfaction. And therefore, what makes me happy on an instantaneous level is for me to conform with what I think everyone else is doing and just listen to the algorithm. But what that will do to me is that it will take away the definition of self, and I will become what the algorithm expects of me to become, right? So the instant happiness, satisfaction, and gratitude comes at the cost of giving up who I could have become if I was not engaged with the algorithmic expectation. Now, as AI people, we want to be responsible. We want to go to work and feel that we are doing ethical things. But there are things that come in this the path of achieving this. I aspire to be a responsible AI developer, but as soon as there is cognitive dissonance, I will give up and I will start to justify my decisions internally to convince myself that maybe the things I'm doing are really not unethical. I'm just a nerd. I'm just a passionate data scientist. I just love to write code. I just love to work with other data scientists. Cognitive dissonance will justify things that may seem very obviously unethical. And then at the same time, I work in big tech companies that have lots of people in them, and that kind of averages out the burden of responsibility that is on my shoulders. And I will say, like, okay, if this was so bad, why is no one in my team saying anything about it? And there's 100 people in that team, and every single one of those 100 people is thinking the same thing internally, and no one is doing anything about it because of the bystander apathy. And what happens is, because I justified the things with cognitive dissonance, and no one in my team said anything about it, I will start building AI tools, which is based on my cultural background and my understanding of the world, by ignoring a whole large population around the world that don't think the same way as me. And therefore, I will start thinking, all these people who claim to be impacted by my AI systems, maybe they don't have a good memory. Maybe they don't even know math. Maybe they don't even know that this AI is good. Remember the Liberian memory exercise. I'm kind of trying to put my own cultural representation of the real world and enforce it across the globe. And anyone who doesn't understand it, I don't even begin to know how they feel because I don't even interact with them. So could we live a meaningful life despite all of this, despite the algorithm making us instantaneously happy, taking away our agency, and then also all of these ways that algorithms make us become what they expect? Now, the answer to that is, if we keep on promoting systems that focus on measurable, monetizable outcomes, there is no way to escape this cycle, because the cycle will optimize itself to monetize and measure. And what is measurable is not always what you want to achieve on an admirability and desirability level. So if you look at what people thought were great lives, people said monetary value, stature, achievement weren't primary. But those seem to be the only things that are easily measurable and quantifiable. Other things are very, very hard to measure and quantify. But algorithmic systems are good at optimizing outcomes that are measurable. So as long as we focus on things that are measurable and monetizable and build AI systems around them, it seems that we're at a contradiction with what we believe might be admirable lives. So thank you so much for listening, and happy to hear your thoughts.
Ebrahim, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have quite a few questions, so let's just get to them right away.